Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to this week's lesson, and this week's topic is how to calculate macros using the insulin index and the keto score with Raphael Sirtoli. I'm excited to announce that there's an amazing new macro calculator that's been developed by Raphael Sirtoli and Nutrita, and this is the absolute cutting edge of low carb and keto nutrition and the future, I think. And there's a dozen macro calculators out there, and I've always been very, very hesitant, as you all know, about putting one on my website because I don't believe counting and being your focus. That's what we don't want anymore. For all of those who've been overweight for a long time, we don't want to do that anymore. But when I first heard about Raphi's new macro calculator, I knew to kind of sit up and pay attention, because not only it's got your macros, it's got an insulin index, a keto score, and a nutrition score. So today I want to welcome Raphael. I'm going to read you what his bio is because I won't remember it all. He's got an MSc in molecular biology and are currently pursuing a PhD in health sciences. His day job is neuroscience research in behavioural and molecular lab, and I've just been hearing about some of his experiments. Raphael is also the co-founder of Nutrita, which is a website and an app helping people grasp cutting-edge nutrition science following a well-formulated keto or low carb diet, or any kind of diet. It's not specifically for that. So we all want to know if we're eating the correct amount of foods in the correct quantities. So Raphael is going to help us understand that. But first of all, I want to thank Raphael for taking up the time and welcome him to Ditch the Carb. So welcome, Raphael.
Thank you so much, Libby. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak to everyone who will be listening. Yeah.
No, it'd be good. And like I say, I've always been very hesitant about putting macro calculators on my website because, you know, I see so many people who get so hung up on the numbers and they don't really look at how nutrient dense, they keep on asking me, is this keto? And we'll get into that later. But what are your thoughts? And we're not going to sort of pick holes in any, but discussing macro calculators in general, what kind of is your thoughts of the ones that are kind of out there at the moment, and what led you to kind of develop this new amazing macro calculator?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question, actually. Why do we need it in the first place? And I think the first thing to say would be that it really depends on the person and where they are in terms of their knowledge about nutrition. So I don't personally need to use our macro calculator because I'm well set with my diet. I pretty much know what I'm doing. I've gotten a lot of benefit out of it already, but that's not the case for a lot of people. And I think there's nothing wrong with providing, a few very simple numbers, but more importantly, some notions about quantities of food that we can then use to intuitively regulate our diet in a way that's not this strict calorie counting and attention to every morsel of food. So it's really the idea to get some basic ideas down, which then help us, get rid of the spreadsheets and the complexity and really enjoy what counts about the diet. And all that takes is, a very basic idea.
Yeah. And I think that's right. And I think people also they start off, okay, they get given sort of like a carb allowance or whatever, whether they want to be moderate, low carb or keto. And they first of all focus on that. Then maybe if that works or that doesn't work, they kind of get a little bit deeper going, well, exactly how much protein should I have and exactly how much fat? And my biggest thing is I'm the same. I don't count, but I know so many people want to count and they want to know, am I eating too much fat? Am I eating too much protein? Am my carbs too high? All of that kind of thing. But what a lot of people don't kind of focus on is the nutrient density of the food and what that does to your insulin levels. And there's two kind of levels. Some people just want to know how many carbs to have, and once they limit their carbs, that probably, I would say, suits 80 to 90% of people. But then there's other people who really want to delve and go, well, actually, it's not quite working for me at the moment, or I don't know if this is working. They want to understand more because they love the low carb lifestyle. So can you explain to us, there's 4 goals that you can set in your in your macro calculator, and then I want you to go through and tell us exactly, and could be a long one, about the insulin score and nutrient score and keto. We'll go through all of that, but what are the 4 goals that people can set?
Right, so the basic idea is that people can get some advice about how to lose body fat. They can learn how to build some muscle. And that will be particularly of interest to older people who have a greater difficulty in maintaining muscle mass, for example. Then they can learn to control their blood sugars, or they may simply be interested in learning about their diet and their food. And in that case, it would be simply to maintain weight, for example.
Yeah.
So those are the 4 basic goals. So then I can go into the insulin index if you want, or we can talk more about the
No,
goals.
I think those 4 goals, I think that's what most macro calculators have, is purely weight loss, and that's it. And I know, and a lot of ladies in my group, they say, well, actually, I've lost the weight. I'm just here because I have to learn how to stabilize my blood sugars. Or we had a lot of type 1 diabetics who want to stabilize, they're not into weight loss. They just want to know, and they especially, I think the insulin index will be phenomenal for them. I really do. I think that opens up a whole new world. And then, like you say, people who want to build muscle mass, that could be, there are a lot of, high-end endurance or even sports athletes out there who have discovered low-carb, and they're not telling anyone because they don't want to lose their competitive edge compared to their competitors. And so building muscle mass, whether you're elderly and you want to build and maintain, or whether you're a sports person or a bodybuilder who wants, and I know a lot of bodybuilders are keto, I think you've kind of pretty much covered, it's not just a weight loss, it's a whole health kind of reign of it. So I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, that was important for us because we know that even the same person at different times may have different goals. And it's important for them to understand how this all works together to get a general notion of how to, manipulate their body composition while maintaining a nutrient-dense diet, and one that's going to work with their metabolism rather than against them. And it's actually, there's a lot of overlap between the different goals, right?
Yes.
And this is important for people to know. However, there are certain parameters that we can tweak to really get the best out of the choices we're making. And I think this is where the calculator becomes really interesting, because they'll be able to understand why they have to hit certain targets, at least, in approximately, to give them a better chance of achieving the goal.
I think that's brilliant. And it also feels to them they've got more personalized results, that it's not just for weight loss, it's for, stable blood sugars or muscle mass or whatever it is. So I think that's brilliant. So let's talk about, tell me, and I don't know if you can do it, you can go for as long as you want to, or what is the insulin index? And then obviously you will have to explain what the nutrient density score and the keto score is, because I think, like I say, I've always been really hesitant about putting a calculator on my site. And as soon as I saw that's what your calculator included, I immediately knew this is the one that I've been waiting for.
Thank you. Yeah, so the insulin index is, maybe the best way to explain it would be to mention something that people have probably already heard of, and that would be the glycemic index.
Yep.
The glycemic index is a measure of how much blood sugar is going to be raised in your blood after consuming a certain amount of food. And essentially, you can think of the insulin index as the equivalent, not in terms of blood sugar, but of the hormone insulin. How much insulin is going to be raised in your blood, right, after consuming some food. Now, this really depends on the quality of the food, meaning, how it's processed, if it's heated, if it's cooked, if it has a lot of sugar, if it has more or less protein, if it has all these different factors really determine how much insulin is going to be raised after a meal. And why do we care about insulin? It's this very important master hormone that can control everything from how much fat you burn to how much cellular growth is allowed in your body. So it's this very important parameter that, quite frankly, we want to use as little as we need. And in order to do that, we have to focus on some nutrient-dense foods that really bring the essentials to us without creating these large variations in the hormone that processed food that you could get, for example, in French fries or in some chips and cookies. Those would be would strongly stimulate insulin and would be high on the insulin index. So this is what this index is trying to get people to understand, that they can choose foods that will keep their insulin relatively low and give them this ability to access their fat stores. And I think that's something many people are after nowadays. They're starting to appreciate the importance of that for fat loss, or even simply for aging gracefully and, with your wits about you. And, the ability to burn fat is really important in that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's, for people who are maybe new here, when they, we talk about, we want to sort of reduce these chronic high blood sugar levels and therefore chronic high insulin levels. And a lot of people don't realize they can still pass maybe the glucose tolerance test, but actually their insulin is up here. So yes, you may not actually, say for example, people may not be classified as maybe pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetic because their glucose is still actually within the normal range, but actually their body, because they're insulin resistant, is producing so much insulin to bring those blood sugars down. And so that's, that's why I sort of talk about, your glucose levels are one thing, but if only we could test our insulin, that would be phenomenal. Yeah. So that's what I love about your insulin index, that it will show, yes, the glycemic index is kind of important, but it doesn't give you the true picture of your insulin and what that's going to be doing to the insulin requirements in your body.
Yeah, so you bring up a really good point, that the glycemic index and insulin index are both measuring these sort of metabolic responses in your body, but they're doing so with different levels of accuracy. Mm-hmm. The reason why we chose to really work on the insulin index and try to produce one that was even more accurate than the ones produced in the original studies was because we believed in the value of this as a really helpful biomarker that people can follow and get some helpful health advice, because the glycemic index is somewhat useful, but it has some important limitations. Yeah. You could have a stable blood sugar level after a certain food, and you would never know whether your insulin was skyrocketing to cover it.
Exactly.
Measure the insulin directly, right? And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get an estimate of how much a food is likely to increase your insulin. So this is useful for people with pre-diabetes, unstable blood sugars, diabetics, and any other condition which is related to blood sugar management, or even any symptom that's related to blood sugar management. So this is really a very basic aspect of wellness that people can sort of look out for, and we can help them make that choice, personalized to them, given that there's this large database as well, of course, on our website that people can access to find a wide variety of foods with that insulin index. And then, of course, go find them in your recipes later on. They're
the perfect complement to each other.
Yeah. That's it.
What is the keto score, and how does that relate to the insulin index?
Right. So an insulin index is important because it's telling us about this metabolic parameter of how our body responds to food. And the keto score is also giving us this information about how our body is responding to food, but instead of insulin, it's about how many ketones we're likely to be able to produce after eating this food. Will we be in nutritional ketosis, which is the goal of a ketogenic diet, of course. So this score is really to simplify the choices for people seeking to follow a ketogenic diet, whether that's for sports or just because they want to give it a try, or because they're seeking to really lose a lot of body fat, like many people are. And we like to pair these scores together so that people can compare and really get a generalized idea. And I think that's why we're going to talk about the nutrient density score later on. But a keto score really is important because there are a lot of questions surrounding, is this keto, is it not, and how much protein should I have, and how many carbs, and how should I count them? So we're trying to simplify all of these choices into one single score for people.
And that's what I love about the macro calculator. You can just take the macros, and you can just have a look at it and you think, okay, that's my carb limit, that's my protein limit, my fat limit. Then if you want to go down, you can then, like you say, look at the foods and go, well, actually, and we'll talk about that in a bit, actually that would be a better option than that food because it's got a sort of a lower insulin index and the keto score and everything else. And you can look at it in different levels. You can just look at the numbers, or you can go more in depth depending on how you want to. So I know we've been testing in my group, and some people have been saying, oh, what's this, what's that? And I said, well, just do whatever you want. If you just want to get the numbers, that's great. But if you want to look into greater depth, then, and I think that's, what we go back to saying before, is when people start low carb, they quite often start off quite simplistically. And that's fine for most people. And other people are just so interested. They want to get deeper and deeper into the whole, how everything affects their body. How does the insulin work? So let's talk about the nutrient score. What is that? And is there a perfect 10 out of 10 food?
Yeah, so we have this nutrient density score, which is really trying to give an idea of how nourishing a food is likely to
Hmm.
be. Now, this is the most difficult one to come up with, really, because there are so many factors that go into, making a food nutritious.
Yes.
There are many, many different micronutrients, right? There are minerals, vitamins, amino acids, fatty acids, and of course, how these things are packaged matter, and it gets very complex very fast. But we think we have a nutrient density score that should guide people towards choices that are really based in science, because a lot of the general guidelines and recommendations about how many vitamins and minerals you need, and in which foods you can go and find them,
Hmm.
the quality of the information is actually quite poor, surprisingly.
Yes.
And we've had to put a lot of work into really refining a nutrient density score from 0 to 10 to account for many of the factors that are going to impact the nutrition of the food. I'll give you a simple example. The origin of your protein in your diet is really important. Whether you get it from animals or from plants is going to have a large impact on not only the ratios of different amino acids you get, which is going to determine literally what your cells are able to do with
Hmm.
this stuff that they actually need and why you're eating in the first place, and of course the total amount. So if you can get it from an animal source, you're getting a higher quality, and this will be reflected in the nutrient density score.
Hmm.
So there are many such considerations that go into our score, and we're trying to once again simplify all of these factors into a easy to understand 0 to 10, which can help guide these choices, along with the keto score and the insulin index. So we're doing a lot of the quantifying for people so that they don't have to get stuck into minutia and complex calculations. And
Yep.
again, the idea is to learn a little bit and then really go at it on your own, and find an intuitive way of eating it.
I think that's great. And I think so many people ask me, is this food keto? Is that food keto? And no particular food is keto. Our kind of overarching ethos is we need to eat nutrient dense whole foods that are as unprocessed as possible, and that's kind of the basis of everything.
Yeah.
And I think your nutrient score will absolutely sort of reinforce that, to go, well, okay, yes, you might want to have this particular food, but it's not it may be keto, but it's not particularly nutrient dense. So I think it's a really good. And do you think that there is a 10 out of 10 food? Or what would be your
Yes,
perfect
absolutely.
meal?
Oh, perfect meal. So that can get. I'll have to give you mine later on, but I'll give you a 10 out of 10. There's, for example, halibut,
Ah,
or lamb,
yep.
or even some perch, or some shrimp, for example. So these are all super nutrient dense options. Shellfish, lamb, of course. In New Zealand, there's a lot of that.
Oh, that's perfect for
Yeah,
me. I love my lamb.
yeah. So, a lot of these type of foods, and of course there are, nutrient dense plant foods as well, even nuts and all of that. But really
Yep.
the 10 out of 10s tend to cluster in the animal foods.
And I think actually, will this help? And I know I have a lot of vegetarians who come to me and say, "Can I do this as a vegetarian?" Because when they try and look at their diet, and if that's very much highly based on carbs, so pasta and rice and bread and things, and they're thinking, well, if I take that out and I can't add the meat and everything else, what can I have? This will actually help them formulate a well-formulated vegetarian or vegan, low carb or keto diet, because it will help them formulate it very well as to what is nutrient
Yeah,
dense and with a protein.
absolutely. Absolutely, there are better and worse ways to formulate any diet, and the vegetarian diet, is no exception to that. I mean, if people are willing to include eggs, for example,
Hmm.
because this is often a source where a lot of the ethical questions raised around how we eat.
Mm.
Eggs, I think, are a really interesting solution that many people can agree on, especially when they're raised ethically. So you can see that with eggs, you'll get a great keto score if they're looking to be on the keto side. It'll be very nutrient dense, and
Hmm.
it'll be a high quality and good quantity of protein. So
Mm.
there are these foods that really everyone can enjoy, and there are just about a million ways to enjoy the eggs and all these sort of things.
I
So
love eggs. I could
yeah,
cook them any which way.
yeah. Yeah,
Teach
exactly.
everyone out there, teach your children how to cook eggs.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great exercise, actually. Absolutely.
Exactly. So let's talk about protein then. You've got there currently the protein set at, I think it was 1.8 gram per kilo per day. Two things, is that can change? Like, can there be maybe a slider at some point that maybe people can choose what their protein is depending, or is that a set level? And what is your take on, this is the biggest question I must get asked when we're calculating macros. How much protein should people be having? If you ask 10 experts, you will get 10 different questions. And you'll have some people saying, no, we eat far too much protein, we should have a smaller amount. And then other people going, no, we don't eat enough. And like I say, there's this massive range. And I think the biggest fear from all the people who are on my website and groups and everything else is that too much protein will kick them out. It will raise their blood sugars and kick them out of ketosis. So what's your kind of take?
Yeah, so the protein question is definitely one of the most controversial ones in
Yes.
the world of dieting. So there's little doubt. I think we could all agree on that at the very
Yes.
least. So there are two sides to this question. There's the question of what it does to essentially your insulin and your ketones.
Yep.
And then on the other hand, what does it do to your blood sugars?
Mm-hmm.
This is essentially the question when it comes to the ketogenic diet. So
Yep.
we recommend 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight a day of protein, mainly from animal sources of higher
And is that
quality.
for everyone,
Yeah.
or do you kind of adjust that or balance that to
Yeah.
people's activity?
Yeah, so this is a standard we have for everyone because this will cover people who exercise pretty significantly and people
Mm-hmm.
who don't. So this was a way to catch everyone in a certain sense. And we have it on the higher side of what some other keto guru and experts will have, like Dr. Finney and Dr. Volek, who recommend between 1.5 and 1.75. So we're just about on their top end. And I think these questions are honestly pretty debatable, but we're pretty happy with this as a default setting. Of course, people can adjust it up and down as they
Mm-hmm.
please. So I think this can, widen the range of people who can follow this sort of recommendation. And the reason is because protein is much more than how much you need to maintain muscle mass.
Yes.
This is actually really important. It goes a lot towards your energy levels, and by that I mean your willingness to exercise, your general mood. It's very important for your immune system. So there are all these functions of high quality protein that are associated with many health benefits. So there seems to be very little downside to erring on the higher side,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. However, it is true that for some people, especially who are highly insulin resistant, they might need to even take a look at their protein when their carbs are already close to zero and they've not managed to enter in nutritional ketosis the way they need to.
Mm-hmm.
So, however, I think, it's always fine to start out on the higher side and adjust down eventually and to
Yep.
see if, everything else is going well for you. But just to give people also a few examples, of what they can expect of protein to do to their body. So you can eat quite a lot of lean beef, for example, and this was an experiment done, many decades ago now, where people were fed more than 600 grams of lean beef, which is equivalent to about 132 grams of actual protein, right?
Yep.
Because there's water and other components in it. And about 66 grams of that converts to blood sugar in the body. And by converts, I don't mean it's like eating sugar. It's not like eating carbs, but when your body metabolizes it, it becomes a sugar, some of that. And this actually doesn't budge your blood glucose levels. So
Oh,
you have
okay.
all this protein that comes in, but your body is actually very well adapted to keeping that in its stable range. So what actually determines, how much blood sugar increases after a meal are other factors than this raw amount of protein. It's things like the incretin system in your gut, these
Yep.
signal systems that actually, they're like readers of food that's coming in and tell your body how to react to it. And of course, when you're eating something like lean beef, this is a food your body is well adapted to consume and digest, and it shows in the metabolic responses, right? And it will, for example, raise your insulin significantly, and people would would wonder, well, is this bad? So should this mean I should moderate my protein?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is that essentially, if it's eaten within the context of a nutrient-dense diet, that response is actually pretty, what we call physiological. It's normal.
Mm-hmm.
The rise doesn't, shut off fat burning. It doesn't have the same effect as a rise with a junk carb sort of donut type food. Right. So there are these distinctions we have to make, and people can see that reflected in our scores, where the label will indicate whether that rise is normal or abnormal, and what they can expect from the food. So again, these considerations can become complicated, but this is all reflected in the scores essentially.
And I think that's the difficult thing, isn't it? What we're sort of asking of a calculator, or we're asking something very simple, a simple answer to something that's very complex and have all these different systems that are all intricately linked, and you can't just get a simple answer. And I think when people ask, well, if I eat too much protein, is that going to raise my blood sugars? And is that going to, say for a type 1 diabetic, do I need to sort of bolus or cover for that insulin? It's more complicated than that, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you asked why. It's set at 1.8 as a default, and people can increase it or decrease it and see how if they can stay within the recommended range, more or less. And of course, this goes to show that we have individual responses to these things. And a reason why we set it so high is not only because we read sort of what's been done in the scientific literature. It's also because we listen to people who are simply trying out the keto diet and telling us, hey, I can eat basically a carnivore diet and my ketones can be 1 or 2 millimoles, and other people can be on a vegetarian diet and have the same readings. So it's really interesting to see how differently this can be done, but there's essentially no downside of erring on the higher side and then just taking a look at your numbers and going from there.
Exactly. And that's so important that, yes, we can look at the numbers, but you've got to tweak it for yourself. I think so many people want it regimented. Some people come to me and go, exactly, what do I eat? When do I eat it? Well, it's going to be completely different. We're all completely different. So you can't just say, right, we all are on 50 grams of carbs and how much grams of protein and so on. It's all going to be different. And you kind of find what works, which not many people want to hear, but it is, I think it is good. And you also have in your calculator of protein and carb equivalents. Explain what they are, because I really like those, that they're really visual. Say, for example, if you set yourself at, say, 50 grams of carbs, it comes out, this is the equivalent to, 0.8 of a cup of berries plus 10 cups of cauliflower, whatever it is. It sets out really just good. And it's not, I think this is where some people who are testing it in the last few weeks, they were getting confused that that's what they should have. And it's just purely an example of what your 50 grams of carbs can look like. And I think for me, it just shows visually, so actually look at how much mashed cauliflower I can have compared to berries or a sweet potato. And then the same with the protein. Look how many eggs or how much steak I can have compared to spinach or, I don't know, cheese and nuts for protein.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. We're trying to give people a very quick and simple impression of how much they can expect to eat, right? In simple terms. So we refer to portion sizes in cups. For example, if it's a raw broccoli, it might be, a cup of chopped raw broccoli has this many carbs in it, and this is how many cups you can have per day. And that's a simpler way of understanding your carb limits than to, start thinking of grams and how much that is in terms of your reference body weight. So once again, it's about, giving some simple measures so that you don't essentially fall prey to carb creep, for example, which is very common, where you see it add up in some hidden items, or because you thought there were a certain amount in certain foods, but actually, no, you miscalculated. So you can always come back to it and adjust the slider and see the differing amounts that you can try. And you can look at it for fruit and starches and leafy greens. So of course, if you're making your own recipe or you're trying to follow a recipe and you want to find out how much ingredient you can do that as well. Or you can look at it in terms of whole recipes as well. So that's even simpler. If you don't want to even to go through the trouble of looking at the individual ingredients, you can just look at it in terms of recipes and find one that's going to fit within that limit. So that's the case for carbs. And for protein, we essentially have the same, but for ribeyes, eggs, and salmon. we chose those three as three examples of high quality protein sources that people can think of in terms of how much they need every day.
And I think it's just a brilliant way. That's what I love about it, because people love those kind of visuals guides. And you're not saying you need this, this, and this. You're not telling people to have, 0.8 of a cup of blueberries and 3 cups of mashed cauliflower. You're just saying this is an example of what, say, 50 grams of carbs look like, or this is an example of what 150 grams of protein. Because I think people get they misunderstand protein. For 100 grams of protein, so 100 grams of meat isn't 100 grams of protein. It will be maybe, say, 30 grams of protein. The rest will be fat or water, whatever else is in there, depending on the cut of meat or whether it's a fatty meat or a lean meat or whatever. So I think it's a very good example just to show people. I mean, I've got lots of charts on my website to show what does 30 grams of protein look like, or what does 30 grams of carbs. And when they realize, you could have half a bagel, or which is nutrient poor and everything else, and will raise your insulin, raise your glucose, or you can have this huge array of different variety of foods which are nutrient dense. They suddenly go, oh my goodness, and they realize, we live like kings. We really do. We live like such amazing, amazing foods when you compare. So I think that's a really good. I love those visual comparisons. I think it's really good. Just an example for people.
Yeah, it's just good basically just to get a first good impression of how much you can expect to be eating. And that is not the only foods, of course, that we're recommending people eat. That's why we have, different recipes that are suggested within the calculator. And of course, then they can substitute that for any other kinds of protein. They can always, use our food search engine if they want more detail on the food. And I know your recipes have all of the quantities listed as well. So it's just to get a good first approximation and not trick yourself, because, as the great physicist Richard Feynman said, we're the easiest people to fool, right? It's very easy to fool ourselves. And this is coming from someone who studies food, as his passion and as a science career. So I know how easy it is. And that's why we wanted to make it as simple as possible with these equivalent. Yeah,
there is the complexities in there if you want it, which is what I love about it. And I know one of the aspects of the calculator, you can choose to exclude, what was it? There was dairy, gluten, peanuts, something else, and then plants. Why would you want to exclude plants? Is that for the carnivores?
Right. So we give people the option to point out which foods they might not want to eat, whether it's because of allergies, or it's simply because they just happen really not to like them and they don't eat them.
Yep.
So most commonly that will be, gluten. That's going to be things like shellfish. And of course, we're starting to realize nowadays, especially with the advent of social media and this ability to really dive deeply into the scientific literature, to see that more and more people are having adverse reaction to a certain number of plants. So most commonly that will be grains and legumes from the nightshade family. Yep. But there's a broader reactivity there that people report essentially some improvements after an elimination diet. And because this is becoming a relatively common option for people, I think it's good to try to cater to that as well.
Yeah.
Because it is important, especially for the goals that they select, that might be highly relevant. So we want to give that an option. And it's in no way to discourage plant consumption if there are no signs and symptoms that you should minimize it or stop. That's why many plants are recommended in the recipes. So this was just to cater to this growing awareness that this is being helpful as an intervention for many people to sort of moderate their plant intake, or even go for periods where they eliminate it to see if that can resolve some lingering issues where they've had trouble getting over.
And that's what I like. Again, yet another thing I love about your calculator is that it's not specifically tailored to one person. If you want to be carnivore, if you want to be vegetarian, whatever is your sort of health goal, your ethical goal, whatever that may be, it covers everybody, and you can kind of manipulate it to however you want and get the data that you want. I think it's brilliant.
Thank you.
And where do you get all the data from? Because I know it's so hard to get data, especially on insulin. Like a friend of mine, Dr. Catherine Croft, she's done a paper on, and I have to read this because I won't remember, identifying hyperinsulinemia in the absence of impaired glucose tolerance. And she discovered Kraft and his database of insulin testing. And so where do you get numbers? Because I know she said that was an absolute goldmine when she discovered that. Where do you kind of get all your data from?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and you know, Dr. Croft is a fantastic researcher, and I think she's done her PhD on this
Yes.
topic, in fact. And it's a really good paper. So anyone who likes to read scientific papers should definitely read that one. Where we get our information is essentially clinical tests that have been done. I think some of the research was done in Australia. There was also the papers by Bell and et al. That were done measuring this in certain people. So this is essentially publicly available information. And of course, there's more that goes into it. Other knowledge of biochemistry and how food interacts with the body helps to refine the score. But those initial measures really inform our scores. So the scores are based on actual experiments in humans, which is really the interesting part, and why, you know, a lot of feedback we're getting from even doctors are saying that this is really interesting for them because they understand the power of a low carbohydrate diet, one which minimalizes insulin secretion. So, you know, it's a really good point as well that you bring up the papers by Dr. Croft, because there's a point that's made in there where she says we need to broaden our understanding of hyperinsulinemia, you know, independent of insulin resistance as an early metabolic risk factor. And what she's saying there is that how much insulin your body produces is actually really important as well. It's not only the condition of insulin resistance, which many people may have already heard of in reference to diabetes and the underlying features of it. So I think this is a good point. We should start thinking, how can we be really careful how we use our insulin? And that's not only through food, that's also through how we sleep, you know? It's also by not smoking cigarettes, for example. There are all these ways that we can minimize insulin secretion. And of course, food is a big one. And this is where we specialize in. But, you know, we'll also recommend people in the summary advice of our calculator to pay attention to their sleep, which is not what normal calculators will do. They will simply think of calories and caloric deficits or gains and these very simplified notions of health. So we're trying to give simple health advice, but with some more depth and nuance to the science behind it.
Yeah, eat well and sleep well and live well.
Right. Yes.
It's pretty much it, isn't it? Yeah, no, I think that goes back to what we were saying before, you know, that people can still have, they can have a normal blood glucose tolerance test, which is what she's saying as well. But your body can be producing such high levels of insulin before the glucose tolerance fails. And, you know, there is that hyperinsulinemia, which is why I love your insulin score, because, you know, people will hopefully pay attention to insulin. And if only we could all test it. And I think they are actually developing an insulin test.
Yes.
And wouldn't that be great? Because we could crowdsource all the information from what we're eating.
That would be fantastic. And it will be coming. It will be coming within.
I think it will be.
Yeah, so
exactly.
Keep an eye out for that.
Right, so I've got 3 questions from my membership. I always get them to ask the exclusive questions. So they've got 3 here for you. Why is height not a requirement for the macro calculator?
Yes, so you've got some observant people asking some good questions. Well, simply, we don't actually need it for the calculations that we're using for the calculator. So these are some pretty standard total daily energy expenditure, TDEE, it's called, TDEE calculations. And we don't really necessarily need height to do them. So, you know, we stick to the idea that anything that's not essential, we discard to make sure it stays simple.
Oh, good. And is height really a sort of a hangover from the BMI? You know, that BMIs are so inaccurate, and they just, you know, that's, I guess, where people are used to putting in their height to get the BMI, because for our lifetime, we've been told by doctors we have to calculate our BMI. So I guess that's where people are thinking they need the height, but we don't.
Right. Yes, and of course, because we're trying to answer the question relative to what, you know, people are looking for in a macro calculator, which is with the expectation of some sort of calorie goal, which of course we don't prioritize, but we still want to calculate accurately. And for that, we don't need height. And you're quite right. That's a hangover from the BMI calculations.
Yeah. And that goes into my second question is why is calorie counting not emphasized?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is a really key aspect of our calculator where we're probably the most different, because there is this very, very difficult to shake notion that ultimately, how can I lose fat if I'm not severely restricting my calories? And I think this is such a difficult idea to wrap our head around, but fundamentally, I think the useful way to think about obesity or fat loss is that the condition of obesity, it's a problem when your fat tissue gets too large. It's not about overeating. It's specific to your fat tissue. You could have a lot of muscle or very little muscle, but your fat tissue would be too large relative to your body.
Yep.
And it's the problem of how energy is partitioned into your body. So we have to think of obesity and losing fat in terms of what can I affect within my health and my diet and my activity and the way I live that is going to move calories towards, my immune system and my muscle, and really not keep storing it in my adipose tissue, right, in my fat tissue. So these are the questions we should be asking. That's why we don't want to focus on calories. Calories are simply there for the ride, right? They come after we've made the decision of where they go. So it's really about focusing on the biology, and in a sense, not pretending, not telling people that they can count accurately and giving them this expectation, which then inevitably fails, which we know very well now from decades of government policy trying to implement it, and this has failed.
Yeah.
So let's not do the same mistake again, right?
And I often say, like when I do my course that I teach them, I say, weight gain is not a calorie imbalance, it's a hormone imbalance. And that's what we need to address. It's the hormone imbalance of, 100, say for in an easy way I explain, it's 100 calories is what we need to worry about is how that affects it both. So 100 calories of carbs is going to affect our body and our hormones completely differently to 100 calories from protein and 100 calories from fat. So calories are almost insignificant. It's how those macronutrients affect our hormones within our body and our insulin levels, which is our fat storing and fat, if it's low enough, it's fat burning. And it's what we need to address in our satiety levels, not the calories. So I'm glad that it doesn't conclude, it's not a focus on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's even aspects of behavior, right? And addiction that surround food. So we certainly wouldn't want to summarize all of this as a calorie goal. I think that would not be recognizing the actual work people have to put into recognizing what works for them. So yeah, we try to stick to advice that has some chance of actually moving people in the right direction.
Yeah. So my final question from them is, and this might be a tricky one, how can a food have a relatively high insulin index, but also a high keto score? Because we're obviously led to believe that if insulin is our fat storing hormone and fat burning kind of turns off, we'd not be in nutritional ketosis. So how would those two numbers kind of work?
I love this question because it goes to show that people are really learning about the science.
They are.
And it's fantastic how this is becoming more and more common knowledge. So the explanation is that basically the way in which insulin is raised in your body matters. And there are different ways to do that. So you can raise insulin because you have some amino acids. So what you digest from the protein, let's say from chicken that you would eat, your body would see that and it would stimulate insulin. Now, this could happen with the glucose, for example, that you would be digesting, right, when you eat a potato. That the insulin would also rise when it sees the glucose. However, the situations are not identical. And that's what the scores are trying to represent, right? On the one hand, let's say the chicken in this example is going to be more keto friendly than the equivalent amount of raised insulin, right, from the same source of carbs, right, if that were from the potato. So we have this situation where we have to give an insulin index, but we also have to recognize that different foods have different consequences, right, when insulin is raised. So again, this is another level that people have to grapple with. But again, not to make it too complicated, but that's why we have the label, right, to simplify this. So it's color coded, so people don't have to guess as to what these numbers signify. It's there, made clear for them, right? If it's good, it will be written in green. If it's moderate, it will be some sort of darker purple. If it's poor, it will be in some yellow code. If it's bad, it will be in red. So these are easy to recognize sort of labels. So of course, some foods are more or less ketogenic, and that depends on the context. Are you in a caloric deficit, or are you in a weight maintenance phase? So essentially, for these deeper dives, this will be available through our upcoming web app, where people can take a deeper dive into their respective goals.
Mm-hmm.
But for now, with the macro calculator and the food search engine, you can already compare the keto score and insulin index, and you'll see that for some animal foods, for example, which raise insulin moderately, an equivalent score for some carbohydrate sources of food, that score would be less favorable for a similar rise in insulin, because of course we've known that with diabetics now, who can eat quite a lot of protein and have stable blood sugars, yet they can eat a relatively small amount of carbohydrate and have a significant rise in insulin, which destabilizes their blood sugars and kicks them out of ketosis.
Yeah.
So we're learning, from diabetics every day, and this is why we have to adjust our scores according to not only the latest science, but what we're seeing in people who test at home. So it's so wonderful to see that people are very observant of these scores, and is this encouraging, really?
No, it's good. They've really enjoyed it. Like I say, I've got a tough crowd in there. They will ask you lots of questions, but they have been really interested in having a go at it. So I think the little tweaks that have been made, I think it's brilliant. So finally, what are your top 3 tips for using the Nutrition Macro Calculator to sort of, whether it's calculating your scores, insulin, what were your 3 top tips for using the app?
Absolutely. So I guess importantly would be to experiment with your protein intake. So that's why we set up the sliders, and we want people to really take raise awareness about, okay, I actually thought I was eating a lot of protein, but I'm actually realizing I'm only eating, barely above maybe the recommended amount. And maybe this is where I have a lot of gains to make. Or someone may be saying, I don't understand why my ketones aren't raised, and I'm not eating any carbs. I don't understand. And of course, there may be one in 100, or the few people who really have to pay attention to their even moderating their protein, which might be necessary for certain more rare conditions like epilepsy, for example, or something like that, which isn't all that rare, unfortunately, but relatively speaking. So that would be one recommendation, to experiment with your protein intake. Then of course, pay attention to the insulin index if you're trying to control your blood sugars. I think that's important to realize, that you can dive deeper, into the recommendations we make and look up the foods and look at their insulin index. So the macro calculator can be a good start to figure out those foods. And then I mentioned sleep, and I'll mention it again because we do put it into our calculator, because it's very frustrating for people to receive this advice and then get stuck and not realize that they were completely forgetting this factor that has nothing to do with food. And we don't want to discourage people when they actually do make the right choice. Right? So you sort of have to think of these really important things even outside of food, to make sure that the smart food choices they make actually take root and really give the best chance to breed success. So it's interesting. So I would just say, as a general recommendation, if you're trying to control your blood sugar, try to look at the insulin index, and try to get some foods that are pretty low on the insulin index, and that could be a good way to go deeper with the calculator.
No, I think it's great. Like I said, I absolutely love it, and I think the overarching sort of summary of everything is, we eat well, we sleep well, and we live well, and we think well, and life and health is not just about what we're eating. It's the whole kind of umbrella of everything that we do in everyday life. No, I think it's brilliant. And like I say, I've waited a very, very long time to put a macro calculator on my website for many years. So as soon as I saw yours, I knew it was completely, completely different. So I think that's great. So to find you, anyone who's watching, and I'm going to put all these links in the video and the comments below. You've got your website, which is nutrition.app. and you've got Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Is there anyone else that they can find you? Is that the best place?
Those are all great. So yeah, there's our website, nutrita.app. There's our Facebook community on there as well. On Twitter, we're at Nutrita_app. And my personal account, which they can also follow, where I tweet about the science and what we're doing with Nutrita, is at Raphael S7 on Twitter. And we're also on Instagram at Nutrita_app. So they can follow us there as well. And we're always talking about, different ways to lose fat or control blood sugars, or understand what really nutritious food is. So if these topics interest people, they'll definitely find more content with us on our website.
I think that's brilliant. And I've already discovered there's so many well-researched and well-written articles on there. I absolutely love it already. So well done to you and your team for creating this amazing new feature and, well, the entire app for us. So we'll be using that a lot. So thank you very much, Rafi, for joining us today. And for anyone who wants to learn more, have a look at the links below. Have a great week, everyone. Okay, bye.